What's up, everyone? I am Don951.
I am Mekkah.
And you're watching chapters 21 through 23 of my Warp Skip Emblem 12 Maniac Mode 0% Gross playthrough. After conquering the Scourge at chapter 20x, we've concluded all the relevant combat that we needed to do in this game, which means that all that stands between Marth and the Shadow Dragon are a couple of thrones and a gate. And you know what that means. It means that things are about to get crazy up in here, not just with the absurd amount of warp that we're about to use, but also with the rescuing, the again uses, and even a touch of thief. And overall, these few chapters are going to be reminiscent of parts of FE5.
So in order to meet all the needs of staff users that we have, we are actually deploying a unit that we haven't really introduced before, but he's been with us for several chapters. His name is Frost, and he's a bishop, and all you really need to know about him is that he has C-ranking staves, and that's pretty much it. So other than the main objective of seizing the gate, we have an interesting side objective. There is a village in the upper right, and first we actually want to visit it with Minerva. We have to end her turn on top of the gate that Marth needs to visit, because that's the way you recruit Michaelis, who is inside there. But once Minerva has done that, we also have to visit it with Marth to get Starlight. And that means that Minerva needs to move off of it, so that is going to take a lot of aganing, rescuing, and warping. We don't have a warp use to spare to get Palla to the boss, so we actually have to dance for her and use an again staff, which we thankfully do have a spare of. This boss is really fast, so too hard to double for Draco Knights. It's actually faster than the Cap Draco Knight, so we have to use a kill lance crit instead of any other means that we would have to kill him.
The one way to kill him, guaranteed, would be to use a Brave Weapon, but we don't have a Brave Weapon that a Draco Knight can use. We ended up getting the Brave Sword, and through a lot of experimentation, I concluded that really the Brave Sword was the only good way to go about doing Chapter 20x, because I tried to do that chapter with the Brave Lance, and it was just horrendously awful in terms of reliability. So, in terms of all the staff users that we need for this chapter, basically every deployment slot that we have that's not a staff target ends up being a staff user. And so we have our two again staff users in Yumina and Wendell. We have our warpers, which are in this case Frost, Etzel, and Katarina, who isn't used for combat in this chapter. Alicia has to do a mid-chapter Hammerne to repair the warp staff. And finally, we need a couple of magic users, any magic user, with the E-rank staffs that can use a rescue staff. And for that, we ended up selecting Sirius and Sita, whom long ago we had reclassed to Sorcerer and Sage, just to free up some reclass slots. But little did you know at that point that I actually planned for this all along, because it does help with the deployment order in this and the subsequent chapters, and I thought it would just be cute for Sita to rescue Marth. The only unit who has no role is Ymir, whom we see in the end of chapter cutscene. All he does in this playthrough, unfortunately, is to give Chris a tiger head hat, but that's chapter 21 finished in one turn, and let's go on to chapter 22.
Chapter 22 is the first of the endgame chapters of this game, the first of 3. In the original FE3 Book 2, you actually had to pick one team for all these chapters and stick with it. You couldn't really prepare, save your formation, switch your formation, pick new units in between. You actually have to do them all in one go, and if you die, you have to go back all the way to this beginning here. In this game, it's a lot more merciful. You can just exchange your units however you want, reclass them, change your formation, whatever you want, and that's a huge relief. So, this is the least complicated of the chapters in this video. There's only one quote-unquote side objective, and it's opening the door. That is pretty much it. When you enter this chapter, Goto actually pretty much tells you to LTC it, and just in case you haven't heard, Nagi also tells you. Nagi is our newest unit, and through us she's just a Dragonstone worth selling, but in casual playthroughs she can sometimes one-shot dragons depending on the difficulty. On hard ones she can one-shot, but on higher difficulty she has more trouble doing it. But this chapter is definitely worth taking their advice for, because it can be a very difficult chapter. There's a lot of really strong enemies to deal with, enemies with long-range tomes, Glower sorcerers that should kill just about any enemy because they negate your resistance, and especially the throne room is heavily infested with strong enemies. So what we do here is actually what the game encourages you to do, and even if you don't have warp, like if you're playing Lunatic, you at least want to use again staff to cheese a little bit, because that throne room is heavily infested with powerful enemies that you cannot just tank. Fortunately, this boss is very slow, and Palla can double them as a Swordmaster with the Little Dong. Now we just seize it with Marth, and that is chapter 22 in one turn. And let's move on to chapter 23.
Alright, so it's onwards to FE12's penultimate map, in which we face the engineer behind all the events that basically happened in this game and in its predecessor, Shadow Dragon. It's our time to defeat Garneth, and the title of this chapter is Dark Pontifex Lives, but we will see about that real soon. So this chapter is a bit more complex, like chapter 21, because we have to engage literally every deployment slot we have available as either a staff user or a staff target. And the reason for this is because of the chests in this chapter that are located in the top corners of this map. They're located in isolated 3x3 rooms, which cannot be accessed except with use of the Warp Staff, or technically the Thief Staff, although you can't use a Thief Staff on a chest that has an enemy standing on top of it. And so for that reason, these chests are only accessible on Maniac mode and below, and not on Lunatic mode. So we use our second to last use of Warp to get Michaelis to the top right room, so that he can kill the Sorcerer there, and that's because that chest contains a Hammerne staff. And recall that we used our last use of Hammer in chapter 21, which means that if we want to use any more Warp for the rest of this playthrough, then we must pick up the Hammerne staff before we break the Warp staff. And we do that with the last use of the Thief staff that Sirius uses, and that ensures that we are set for the rest of the game.
Now with all those new warp uses, we can use those to warp Katarina to Garneth and murder him in a second. And we can also use it to secure the other chest in the other room that has the Alm Staff, which revives one of your units if they have been killed on the battlefield. To get this chest, we cannot use the Thief Staff since we broke it, so what we actually have to do is kill the Sorcerer but then warp Julian over to open the chest. Katarina, the only way that she can kill Garneth is, of course, well, first of all, she needed all those stat boosters, and she also needs to get a pretty low percent crit because Starlight doesn't really have a high crit rate. That is pretty much the only way that we can win against Garneth, but they say we can't do it at all, so we've improved on that in that regard. And that way we get the Falchion, which is one of the few weapons that can actually harm Medius to some extent. Considering this is 0% growth, I think we have a different plan of how to get rid of Medius.
That is no doubt correct. So after tying up some loose ends, Mars still needs to be warped to the throne, and we do that by having Fina act as kind of a stand-in staff user. And after everyone has moved, notice the formation that we have at the bottom of the map, where we have a literal row of staff users as far away from the enemies as possible. If our 5 Draco Knight formation around Marth was emblematic of the playthrough back in chapter 12, then this formation is definitely emblematic of the playthrough at this point in the game. See you next time for the finale.
See ya.